weeks. Yeah.
He finally
Is that,
decided to get
is
rid
that
of me.
accurate? That's accurate, Paul, right?
Yeah, he did a great job,
And,
Scott.
and you'll continue to bug the crap out of me until this damn Terminator happens.
Yes.
So I have some updates, and I just reran all my metrics before I ran out to coach at 5 o'clock. But I haven't put them in any kind of sensible or fancy order. So what I'm going to do is show you kind of where we left things off. So we left things off on my daughter's birthday on the 11th of November. That's how I know what day it was when I spoke to you last. And a funny thing happened that week. Other than that, and other than the Orange Man being defeated, well, that was the week before. But I think the Sun got rather disgruntled and decided it didn't really want to flip cycles and kind of went back in its shell. So so I don't know, was everybody on? I don't need to recap any of that stuff, do I?
Probably not.
Everybody remembers the crazy blue and white plots, and we just did a paper came out yesterday, I believe, on the connection between solar cycles and El Nino. It's kind of the missing link. If anybody wants to take a look at that, I can send a link to Paul later and we can post it. But I'm sure that'll be wildly ignored. But so let me see if I can share my screen, catch my breath, because I literally came in the door when I got your text. So and my wife's like, where the hell are you going? Didn't you work enough today? Well, hell yes. But so can everybody see that slide? Okay.
Yes.
So
yes.
So what I'm going to do, some of you may or may not know, I gave a talk to the New Mexico Tech Fest a couple of 6 or 7 weeks ago, I guess, sometime in 2021. And I gave a little situational update. So I'm going to show you that, and then I'm going to bring it current. So the stuff that I made this morning, but you'll just have to hang with me while I pull those plots up. So I'm going to play this presentation. And so here's the status. We are still awaiting Arnold's arrival. It's complicated. Nobody said this was easy. I think I was baffling myself, thinking that this was going to happen linearly. If you kind of remember, we had this plot. And this plot shows the last 20 something years of the 10.7 centimeter radial flux. It goes up to 2018. I'll show you the most recent one, but the idea here was just to show that the terminators have a lovely switch on. And where we left it in November was right here. So it was tonking along, and then everybody got really excited because we had this massive uptick in activity around about the election day, if you remember. Except it did this. Okay, so it had a crescendo about start of December, and then started coming. Isn't that if you were looking at a chirp signal on one of an old oscilloscope, this is gorgeous, right? The unfortunate thing about this, and this is part of the challenge, is it all came from the sun's southern hemisphere. So the sun, unlike the models, the sun actually is a sphere. It's not flat, and it has two hemispheres, and they're both coupled, but we don't really understand how strongly coupled they are. And it may well be that it's the magnetic field that does the coupling. But, you know, in certain circumstances, the buggers will be completely independent of one another. And almost all of this activity was southern. Do you remember we had a huge slew of active regions? They basically were separated by about 40 or 50 degrees in longitude. This was, you know, if you remember the red, white, and blue plot, we're waiting for the event like the thing in 2011. You know, this isn't up to date. I'll show you the most current one. If you remember, I said that, you know, activity is longitudinal. So when the terminator happens, it doesn't just happen at latitude. So we don't just see emergence happening of magnetic fields and structures emerging at about 35 degrees latitude. It actually spreads like a wildfire all around the sun. So like when this activity changes, it goes from having 1 or 2 sunspots to having 5 or 6 or 10 or 20, and they spread around all longitudes. And in general, it happens in both hemispheres. And the oddest thing happened, and this is very typical for people that study the sun, is that we think we understand what the hell's going on, and then that damn plasma ball throws us a curveball, right? So this is old crap. So better data, crap data, similar signature. This is what we've been waiting for. And so here's what it looked like in late February. So the same plot. So exactly the same as this guy, but now extended almost a decade. Where you see, you know, here's the activity that was giving rise to those beautiful pulses and radio emission in the southern hemisphere. You can see that they're separated by 30, 40, 50 degrees in longitude. There was sporadic activity in the northern hemisphere, but what we were really waiting for was the equator to completely collapse, right? So when the equator completely collapses, all of the cycle 24 magnetic field is gone, which then allows cycle 25 to just erupt, okay? And we got, if you look at this as a function of longitude, there's this weird patch between 60 and 180 degrees longitude where the equator collapses as the southern hemisphere lights up, but the northern hemisphere or other longitudes have not. So it's become really imbalanced both hemispherically and longitudinally. So if you can get that in your head, it's like having a permanent hurricane sitting there. You know, catching up a little bit in time, if I look at my latitude versus time plot, and sorry that the axis is kind of hidden here, but there's the pulse of activity in the southern hemisphere in the late part of the year. Here's the tiny little thing in the north. I'm going to show you the extra 3 months of data on that one. So you can see beautifully the overlapping in the bands in this plot. You can also kind of get a hint that the southern, so if I draw the equator across the middle, that the southern hemisphere has changed, but the north is still hanging on. So for whatever's going on around the equator, the northern hemisphere just doesn't want to die. Okay? Stupid sun. So if I look forward a little bit, and I don't think I had made these the last time I talked to you guys, because one of the kind of gauntlets that's been thrown down in comparing what we've done relative to what the NOAA and NASA people have done, is to look at, you know, what our prediction actually looks like in context with all the others. And so putting it on the cycle 19 context, this is still the forecast that we have at hand. Okay, this has actually been adjusted down because we like I said, if you remember what I said, we need the terminator to be able to tell us what the amplitude is going to look like. So at this present time, it's 10 years. So we're counting on from 10 years. If you remember, for the cycle 25 to be smaller than 24, which is what the experts are saying, we would have to wait for a further 3 years for the terminator to happen. Okay, it would be the most unusual solar minimum of all. In fact, it would probably get close to getting people squirrely about a grand minimum at that point if it happened. I just cannot see it. So just for context, here it is in an 80-year span. Go ahead. Did you have a question? No? So the top one's an 80-year span, and the lower one is a 30-year span. And I've actually, at least on this plot, and I'll show you in a little bit more detail in a second, actually put current data on from when our forecast started. So at least in this context, it's actually not too bad. Now, if I show you this guy, so this is now zooming in a little bit, and I'm going to compare to you this kind of teal cross-hatching here illustrates what the NASA NOAA forecast is. Now, very early in 2021, when we were going through that peak of activity, it was quite possible that by September of 2021, we were going to go right through that forecast. Okay. And bear in mind, they said that maximum of cycle 25 would occur in 2025. Okay. So all the way up here. Still don't think that's likely. Okay. So what this base plot is basically shows the error bars on our forecast in the gray area. It has red and blue, and these basically mark out very broad windows. So these are 3 sigma windows for when we think the hemispheres are going to peak, right? And this is based on 160 years of analysis. They're pretty broad, but like these are 3 sigma things. If I showed you 1 sigma, they'd be about about a third of that width. But nobody likes to show one sigma because I guess nobody really believes 1 sigma. But so I'm not going to go back over this again. But what I'm going to show you is the real current stuff. So this goes up. So we had this beautiful ringing like a bell. Picking up again in March. Okay. The funniest thing is this is now the northern hemisphere. Okay, so it's sloshing, the big ball of crap is sloshing around. It's playing games with me. And so if you don't mind, while I close this, I am now going to go in and find the really current stuff. So just bear with me just a second, because I posted it to a friend last night and I got to find it. So I'm going to do this on the fly because I didn't have time today to put it in a slideshow. So you can
Scott,
see
didn't you summarize before and say that your theory was based on the amount of time between the rises of the solar cycles, and that the more time it delays, the bigger the cycle is going to be?
Oh crap. Are you still there? Yeah. It's actually it's the difference between the Hale cycles, so the magnetic cycles. So if the Hale cycle endpoints are closer together, the amplitude goes up. If the Hale cycle amplitudes are separated out, the amplitude comes down. So if you remember correctly, when we talked last time, we were talking about 9.5 years. The average is about 11. Okay. So at this point, we've just gone past 10 years since the last one. Right? So we're still going to be way higher than average. But if you believe the consensus, we're going to have to be waiting for a long time for this thing, because our relationship bang balls on nailed cycle 24. Okay, so I kind of tend to believe the data. Hold on, I'm trying to find this stuff. All right, so where are we? Excuse all the memes. All right, see if I can focus in on this window. All right, so hopefully there's no trash talking going on with my buddy that I'm communicating with here. But here is the present state of the hemispheric sunspot number. And if you look at it, again, black is north, blue is south. Sorry, black is total, blue is south, red is north. And so we see this pulse here at the end of 2021. That was when we all got really excited, but it's dwindled off. If I show you in terms of latitude, if you guys can see that, you can see, here's the sporadic spots that we've had. There's predominantly in the southern hemisphere, and there's been a few little ones, and a couple more recently in the northern hemisphere. If I look at that over a much longer time scale, you see this, there's the start of the butterfly wings. Now, these are the longitude versus time plots. So if you remember, what we're looking for here is for the equator to die. So this is the southern hemisphere. Here's the beautifully longitudinally separated active regions that appeared in the late part of 2020. They lasted for about 3 rotations, and then we're gone. Okay. Bloody sun. If I show you the northern hemisphere, you can see so this is very current. This was completed just this morning. So you can see the present activity is growing in the northern hemisphere. Okay, if I'm going to skip the next one because that'll be baffling. And here we go to the equator. So again, remember, what we're looking for is the equator to go like orange or red. This is, again, only a couple of days old. You see that there is orange and red at the same range of longitudes. So one part of the southern hemisphere has stopped making magnetic fields, and the other part is still going. Show you a bit more about that. Don't need to worry about that plot or that one. That's just showing. So this is the current data is the white curve here. So this is temporal evolution of these extreme ultraviolet bright points as a function of time. And so the current one is the white curve. And so you can see the activity bands at about 25 degrees latitude in the southern hemisphere and about 20 degrees long latitude in the northern hemisphere. The south is much stronger than the north. And you can also see this dip in asymmetry around the equator, right? That's probably more pronounced and easier to see here. So this is basically the temporal evolution of the same measure. So these small solar active regions. And what you're looking out for here, what you'll see a lot of is the 28-day modulation. So the fact that the longitudinal pattern stays fixed. There's the burst at the tail end of 2020. And here you can see that the southern hemisphere, round about the equator in the southern hemisphere, has kind of died. But the northern hemisphere, it lives on, just like Fletch, right? Fletch lives. If I show you in a broader context, you can kind of see that the southern hemisphere has kind of died. There's the 2 beautiful bands of cycle 25 just waiting to erupt. Okay, so if you remember, I said we've been tracking them for years. Okay, you can see sorry, that one shouldn't come up. So I'm trying to find the cycle 25 update. Here we go. So let me pull these up and let me kill this. Ding. And then let's see if I can make this work, Paul. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to share again. And so here are the up-to-date versions of those three figures that I showed you. So this is the broad context. This is the narrower context. And of course, this is monthly data. So I updated it only this morning for April. And there is the present status. So it went up and down, and now it's climbing again. So it seems to have kind of fallen below the curve. But if you're crafty, like some of my colleagues, and if I jump onto Twitter, I can show you something else. So boom. I apologize if you get to see my email, but I'm going to show Chris. So one of my colleagues on Twitter likes to tease me, and I'm trying to find, so you can see if I share this window, I'm going to share my web browser. Okay. So you can see my web browser now. So I'm cruising through Twitter. My buddy from Austria likes to tease me. Okay. And what he does is he basically runs these monthly diagnostics to show me how wrong I am. Okay. So here is Chris's plot. So he's pretty fancy with the data. And so I don't know if he's half teasing me or half teasing the NOAA NASA guys, but whatever he's doing a pretty good bloody job of it. Plots are beautiful. So our prediction basically is this red curve. The NOAA NASA panel is the blue curve. The green line is the mean since 1750, so it's going back quite a way. But you see that, and with the observed daily data and the observed monthly data, we're actually not doing too bad. It still looks like it's going to be higher than the consensus. And so it's one of these situations where only time will tell. But as I keep reminding everyone that wants to gloat and say that we're wrong, is if they read the paper, they noticed that we said we were only going to get fidelity on our forecast when the terminator happens. So we're still waiting on both halves of both hemispheres of the sun to synchronize. We're kind of hoping that that's going to be, one of my colleagues said that they kind of, based on what we're seeing in the radio flux, anticipate that to be sometime in the next 3 or 4 months. But I've been lucky. Part of the reason that Paul's not been able to get hold of me is I've been helping compile massive reviews of my work. Not my work, but the lab. And that's sucked my entire will to live. So doing this stuff is a bit of a pleasure and a distraction, but I don't get a lot of time to do it these days. So I'm going to jump out of the share. And I know I went through that super duper fast. And I know I also promised Paul that I would put updates on the web. So what I'm going to try and do is find a little bit of time on Wednesday mornings to post in that thread that I started eons ago on your news feed. So, or I'll tell my postdoc to do it. So I'll throw down the gauntlet to someone. But does anyone have any questions? Science is hard. We're still pretty confident that when the event happens, we're going to have a very clean prediction. The prediction's still holding it. It's going to be higher than average. And all the experts are probably going to have egg on their face. So, any questions? Sorry if I went really fast.
So worst case, when would you expect it to happen? I mean, you know, we've obviously we expect it to have happened already, but you know,
Yeah.
how far down the road?
It's so what we saw there. So that was, I describe it as a Rossby soliton. So it's kind of like the atmospheres. So what the solar's atmosphere seems to be doing, it seems to be sloshing back and forth. So what we really need it to do is settle down. I don't know. It could be a couple of months. It sure as hell won't be 3 years.
So what I'm seeing is that if people are going to go out and do de-expeditions or get radios set up or antennas, they better do it pretty quick. Next year or two is things are going to start.
It's going to be prime time. Yep. Yeah, because it, as you saw in November, when it started really fast, right? And that's what we've been trying to emphasize with these termination events, is that that's the trigger. When that happens, activity just starts growing like crazy. And if it's going to be a big cycle, we're going to go straight away.
Well, that was somewhat of a tease. I mean, there was a few days there when 20 was open night and day.
Yeah. Yeah, and so when we get those big longitudinally steady regions, or you get them where they're 30 or 40 degrees apart on the sun, you're going to get almost continuous, right? And so when we get to a point where the hemispheres are synchronized, you're going to have a great time.
Scott,
I mean, go ahead.
The asymmetry, or that pulse in that southern hemisphere that came up, you and your slide that showed the butterfly diagram, you know, many cycles back, none of them show the asymmetry that we just saw. Is it possible that something weird's going to happen to the sun that's beyond any history that we know of, like right off the map?
That's entirely possible. Usually that, you know, when you make some kind of prognostication, right, the sun's always going to try and screw you, right? If you remember, I think when I spoke to you guys last time, I described the sun as the breaker of models, right? You know, it's kind of like trying to forecast the weather. You can only do so good. So
what's reporting what's happening is hard enough, but predicting the future is a little bit more difficult.
Right. Yeah, I think there's been some famous quotes on predicting the future from several prominent scientists, and maybe even Weird Al, or yeah, no, it's tough, but you know we know what we're waiting for. So it's just a case of there's clearly something going on in the northern hemisphere that's stopping it from finishing. And you know, in past cycles, there's a hint that what we, and I don't know if you remember, when we talked about this, when we were looking at the Hilbert transforms of the data, the thing that allowed us to map out the terminator points, we noticed when there was very extreme activity, the Hilbert transform wasn't linear. So it actually had a knee. It's like a frequency spectrum, right? When a frequency spectrum has a break, saw those, and then again 2017, and they seem to correspond with massive eruptions.
Scott, we lost you there for about 10 seconds.
Yeah, and what I was talking about was knees in the Hilbert transform spectra, and we noticed those. We mentioned it in a paper, but we haven't really dialed in, but they correspond with significant eruptions. And we think that if there's a lot of eruptions in a given hemisphere, it actually can slow down the mechanism, right? So we've seen a few examples of this where one of the things we think slowed down cycle 24 that made it so long was that the significant activity of Halloween 2003, believe it or not. So it was enough to slow it down, to move it to the right, which extended out the terminator separation, which brought the amplitude down. So if you think about magnetic field, if you destroy a shit ton of it, and if the motion towards the equator is governed by how much field that you have, then if you destroy a lot of field with big eruptions, you're going to slow down the machine. So there's a lot of hypothesis in what I just said, and potentially a lot of bullshit. So, but no one is exploring this kind of evolution of how the inside of the star works. So, hi, Peter.
Yeah, hi, Scott. Thanks for your chat. I was just wondering, how deep into the interior of the sun is this phenomenon being manifested at the surface and above it? How deep into the interior of the sun is this phenomenon taking place?
It's a great question. So based on this analysis and other analyses, we think it's about 70% out from the core.
Oh,
so the way we look at it is the sun's interior is a rigid rotator. It's probably not rigid, right? The big hydrogen ball, but it's so dense it's practically rigid. And then there's an ocean of hydrogen sitting on top of that that's bubbling away, convecting, right? Driven by the nuclear furnace at the core. And so as the density drops off, it becomes more like a fluid, but I mean, it's really a plasma, right? And so as you heat it, you strip electrons off the hydrogen. The moving electrons create currents, which make magnetic fields, which blah, 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 right? And so we think that where these large donut-like bands appear is right about 70% out, maybe about 70 to 75%. And then what happens is those structures become buoyant, or parts of them become buoyant, and they erupt in like a U shape. And when that pierces the surface, it looks like a sunspot pair, right? So if you remember, when we chatted last time, I talked a lot about buoyancy, right? And the whole thing is about pressure balance. So, and it's very funny. The same thing happens in our upper atmosphere. We have these things called sudden stratospheric warmings. They probably destroy any kind of coherent signal that you guys have, because they love to mess with the ionosphere. So, so that's where we think it's happening. Of course, it's impossible to tell for sure. Right?
And is that sort of a uniform shell around the interior of the sun?
Yeah. So if you think about the rigid rotator on the inside, the region is we call it the tachocline. And basically it's kind of like the thermocline in the ocean, right? Mm-hmm. But it's a dynamical interface. Everything's rigid below that, and everything's slips above it. And so if you think about it, if you've got an object rotating under your ocean, there's a shear layer between where it's rigidly bound to that surface and where it's sloppy. And so the point where it transitions from one to the other is the tachocline. And we think that that's where the shear forms that helps generate the magnetic field. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's the prevailing wisdom. 30, 40 years from now, we could be saying something completely different. But that seems to agree. If you remember, I showed a lot of plots and I talked a lot about 55 degrees latitude. And the fact that all of this phenomenology recurs about 55 degrees latitude on the sun. And that would also be consistent with something taking place at about that depth. So if you imagine a sphere and imagine a sphere of about 75% inside of that, where those tangents to those two circles meet is about 55 degrees latitude. So
Scott,
Mhm.
you've got all the great information that you have access to. Where do we look as individuals, whatever, where do we look to see what maybe is happening? I mean, is there,
Well,
are there
why don't
websites that we can?
I'll take the action item to go and sound all corporate, but I'll take the action item to make a post on the webpage that gives you these resources. And there's some beautiful, I don't have all the tabs open in my browser. I have them all in my phone because that's how I check this stuff. First thing I do in the morning is check all this stuff. But what I'll do is I'll make a post, and we've got some beautiful images of all the longitudes of the sun.
Cool.
And so you can watch and you can see how well separated the regions are. In fact, if you pay very close attention, you can see the asymmetry around the equator. So the northern hemisphere is more active than the southern hemisphere, even at the very subtle levels. So I'll make a list of kind of observational resources that you guys can go look at.
That'd be great. Yeah, we can sit there and go, now what would Scott think?
And it would probably have an F-bomb thrown in it somewhere.
Oh, okay.
Or
what,
not.
Yeah, what was Scott thinking?
Yeah, right. There you go. That's probably not.
Scott, for my 6-meter de-expedition to French Polynesia 6 months from now, am I going to have ionospheric propagation or just off the?
Oh gosh. Oh man, you're entering into the realm where I have to bow to you. Okay. Now I'm not even going to say that because I'll just look stupid.
Just tell him to take a couple extra amplifiers and everything will be okay.
There you go. You answered him, Rick. But yeah, this is where I get to learn from you guys. So,
Cool.
Scott, I know there's been many years of the 10.7 centimeter, I think it is, or 10.3. Are there other radio records that span a few decades at least that are in similar zone to the 10 point the Penticton data?
Peter,
and what pattern do they show?
Well, they used to. Oh, they all. So 10.7 is predominantly what we call coronal, right? So this is why it's such a good diagnostic, because you can get radio flux from the photosphere of the sun, lots of it, right? That's what causes a lot of noise.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't show you, it only shows you the baseline. So the coronal stuff shows you when it switches on. And I believe there's a very interesting story. Ken Tapping told me one day, but I can't remember it. Ken Tapping runs
I know
the
Ken.
Dominion Radio Observatory, right? He's a character and a half.
Yes, indeed.
About how they came about 10.7. And it was some wartime thing.
Art Covington.
Possibly classified. But I think because of that is why it was used. Now in Europe, there's an interesting story that every country that the Germans invaded in Europe, they went to the highest peak in that country and established a solar observatory. Right? Mm-hmm. And at the time, a guy called Carl Zeiss lived. Carl Zeiss was a master of optics, right? His company's rather famous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Zeiss had these beautiful chronographs built. And so the Germans put these chronographs, very beautiful chronographs, around all these high peaks in Europe, and a lot of those observatories still exist. So I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, but I think what happened was because the fact that it was a definitive signature of radio disturbance, Peter, that it just, people just kept measuring it. So, and the Japanese have the Nobayama Observatory, and I think they just closed that. So I don't know enough. I know a bit about the broadband or the more narrowband radio that the folks at Owens Valley do, and Alma and these bigger observatories, but I don't know much about the broader channel stuff.
Okay, thank you.
But there's a lot of interesting stories about solar physics, and the observatory that I ran was started by a guy called Walt Roberts that some of you may or may not have heard of. And he was sent to Colorado for exactly the same reasons that the Germans went to high peaks, right? So the War Office in Washington wanted to know if the sun was going bananas because they'd figured out that they couldn't radio London, right?
Yeah.
And you know, if any of you are war buffs and you've watched the movie Tora Tora Tora, you will have found out that Pearl Harbor had a space weather connection because the Air Force calls it bad atmospherics. And so in that movie, there's a clip of them talking to the radar guys, and they're saying, well, we can't talk to the mainland because there's bad atmospherics. And they actually, one of the reasons they couldn't get data back to the mainland or communicate. So, you know, people don't like to talk about that too much. But anyway, so there's all kinds of crazy analogies about this stuff and where it originated from. And I think 10.7 just became a very clean diagnostic of solar activity, and they kept going. It's the same as the green line and the red line in the optical. So are there any other questions? I can smell my dinner up the stairs.
Yeah. How far back does your data go? As I can remember atmospheric conditions in the 1970s when the fans were wide open 24 hours a day.
70s were booming. The 80s and the 70s, all the way 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was booming. Then it took a nosedive. The F10.7 data goes back to 1939, funnily enough. The chronograph data goes back to about the same time for the reasons I just discussed. And the sunspot data goes back to 1600. Some of the other observational data that we've used goes back to the 1860s. So typically the plots that I've showed go back to the 1860s. So we can take this back very cleanly 14 solar cycles.
Well, Scott, we need to let you go, and so that maybe you'll come back again.
So I've given myself that action item to put that list of stuff up for you guys, so you can go and look at the same data that I look at when I'm pounding my first 3 pots of coffee in the morning.
That'd be
Thank
great.
you. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
Let you get back to your dinner. You know, you could have just told your wife to bring it down there. We don't mind you eating while you're talking.
Yeah, dude, that doesn't work in my house.
I'm sure.
So, but you know, it's always a pleasure to talk to you guys, and I hope everyone's doing well and keeping safe through this madness.
Sure.
You're all getting your vaccines and, you know, being safe.
Thank you.
Okay.
You too.
We're doing our best. Thanks.
Thanks. Scott, how
Thank
will
you.
we get the info that you said it'd be on a website?
Yeah, I'll make a post on the what did you call it, Paul?
Front
Sorry.
range 6-meter group.io.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where I'll make a post in the morning. Okay. And if I don't do it, I'm sure Paul will remind me.
I'll keep after you, man.
Thank you so much, Scott.
All right.
Appreciate
Cheers. Take care. And Peter, thanks very much for your email last night.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Scott.
that. All right. See you guys later. Take care.
Cheers.
All right,
Yeah,
all right.
cheers.
Good night.